in our 2021 speaker series on the theme A World on Edge. We've had 4 speakers this fall, and we will have 5 this spring. So please watch out for those. All of them will be on Fridays at 3:30, so you can black out this day and time. The next speaker in the series is Alyssa Battistoni, a brilliant political theorist who works on climate change. Alyssa will join us to speak on February 12th, 2021. Please don't miss it. So my name is Joel Wainwright. I'm introducing this event today because I have the pleasure of serving as the speaker committee chair. But I'm now going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Professor Huyen Lei, who will introduce today's speaker. Over to you, Huyen.
Thanks, Joe. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Clio Andris as our colloquium speaker today. Dr. Andris is an assistant professor in the School of City and Regional Planning and the School of Interactive Computing at Georgia Tech. She is the director of the Friendly Cities Lab, which focuses on data-driven love for community. She is a member of the Center for Spatial Planning Analytics and Visualization, and also a member of the School of Interactive Computing's Information Visualization Research Group at Georgia Tech. Dr. Andris' research focuses on mathematical models of social networks, social flows, and interpersonal relationships in geographic space applied to issues of urban planning, visualization, transportation, and geography. Her work has been widely featured on the media. You can check out her very interesting work on connected places and how this connection reflects the cultural diversity and ideal flow of a city. Her most recent work on risk assessment of COVID-19 provides tools for individuals and policymakers to control the spread of COVID-19. Dr. Andris received her PhD from MIT in 2011 in urban information systems. She held postdoctoral positions at the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology, otherwise known as SMART, and the Santa Fe Institute. I met Clio at the Trellis UC-GIS workshop in Washington, D.C. in 2019, and she's also a native of Washington, D.C. And Dala and I are both big fans of her work. And in addition to her impactful research, Clio has been working to promote success of underrepresented minorities in higher education. She and her colleagues were awarded the Carolyn Mary Mentorship Grant from Trellis and UC-GIS to connect and engage the community and to inspire mentorship in GIS science. They created a series of video-based seminar featuring women scholars in GIS science. So you can check it out at gisconnect.github.io. So I dropped this in the chat box. With that, please join me to welcome Dr. Clio Andris.
Thank you so much for that's such a nice, warm introduction. Thank you, Huyen. And yes, we got to meet in Washington, D.C. in the Trellis GIS for Women organization. And it was just such a wonderful experience, and it was great to make that connection. All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And I just want to thank you all for coming today. I know that this is the week before Thanksgiving break, and you probably all have quite a lot on your minds of family and plans and that type of thing. So I just wanted to say thank you, and thanks to Ohio State for having me. All right. And I am on Twitter. I probably follow some of you. I know I follow Harvey. I see your tweets a lot, and I love all of them. So please feel free to get in touch that way as well. So hello, Ohio State Geography. I would love to be in Columbus with you right now. It's not a far drive from here, and the leaves are just gorgeous along the way. I got a chance to visit Derby Hall and your department in 2007, and so I was very impressed with this gorgeous oval and your building, and the whole entire city is just fantastic. And so I wish I was there today, but I do have knowledge of how great it is, and I also got to try a Buckeye when I was there, and it was one of the most delicious things I've ever eaten. I also got to watch a practice of Script Ohio Well, I was there. It wasn't at a game or anything like that, but I got to see them practice it. And I forgot who was dotting the I that weekend. It was a home game. But I remember really liking this, not just because it spelled out something geographic, but it also sort of looked like Clio, which made me super happy. So I know that you all are in a very, very special place, and I wish I was there too this weekend. So I usually don't give a who am I sort of overview, but since we didn't have a chance to meet one like in the group with the grad students as we usually get to do during these wonderful geography colloquiums and go out to dinner and such, I thought I would make things a little bit personal during this talk. I am a geographer turned urban planner turned geographer turned urban planner / interactive computing prof. I've switched departments, getting a master's in geography, a PhD in planning, going to a geography department, going to a planning department. But all the time I'm a GIS person. I'm a geographic information scientist, and we work in a lot of different departments. As you know, we can be found in forestry or information science, and most often geography departments. But that's who I am. I'm also now a geovisualization person. I am a dual hire between city planning and computer science, and so I do more geovis here. And I teach both CS and city planning classes here at Georgia Tech, and I've been here for about 1.5 years now, and I'm just loving it. And I had the wonderful, wonderful opportunity to be at Penn State Geography before this. I also direct the Friendly Cities Lab. It is a great initiative. We have a lot of wonderful students here, and we're housed at Georgia Tech, and we do social spatial network analysis, different types of regional network analysis, and urban planning initiatives for interpersonal relationships. And this has been a busy couple of weeks for us because we created a tool for COVID. And I'll show you that very briefly here. I'm not sure if anybody has seen this risk assessment planning tool, but it got a lot of press, and we've been doing a lot of outreach, helping people assess their risk of COVID. So I thought I would just take a second and show that to you if it was of any interest. What this tool does is it was created between me and Professor Joshua White and our respective graduate students at Georgia Tech. And it allows you to click to select an event size. So like how big your dinner table is going to be for Thanksgiving, or whether you're going to have a small gathering to watch. You may have gone to watch election results, or perhaps you have you went to a graduation party, or over the summer you were interested in going to a wedding. We've had this up since about June or July. And I know that when you have a geographer here and cartographers here, yes, we have a Mercator projection. Alaska is way too big. We know that we couldn't get around that, unfortunately, but at least you have a bit of a caveat here. But I know that as a geographer, it hurts to see cylindric projections on these maps like this. But here we go. For example, if we were in Franklin County, we know that the current risk of a group of 10 people in Franklin County, the current risk of having 1 or more people there being infected with COVID has been computed by our model to be about 23%. And what we do with that is we take in case rates from the New York Times. We take in county population from ACS from 2018. And then there's something called the ascertainment bias down here. And that just means for every diagnosed person, how many asymptomatic people do we think are asymptomatic infected people do we think are just walking around? And then we actually compute the probability that no one has it. So that multiplies person by person, and then we take 1 and subtract the probability that no one has it, and we get this risk level. So this isn't something I probably could have predicted to want to talk about when we first scheduled this talk today, but I thought that since it has been getting a bit of attention, it would be nice to share it with some geography colleagues, and I'm really happy to get some of y'all's feedback about this after the talk, especially because I don't have any geographers right nearby where I am. So it means a lot to me to get the chance to talk with you about it today. So we'll put that on hold and maybe we can chat about it at the end. All right, and geographers like you all are very crucial right now, and you all know that, and how hard you probably are working on some COVID-related things in space and transmission, and the role of parks. A lot of really important factors here need geographers for this. So that was my introduction, and now I'll talk about the talk. So the outline today is we'll talk a little bit about spatial social networks. We'll look at a case study of the US Mafia, and we'll look at a little bit about what's next for spatial social networks. And this case study from the US Mafia came around when I was at a new faculty gathering at Penn State, and I met a sociologist there who said that he was working on Mafia networks and casually mentioned that he had the addresses of the different Mafia members, and I said, oh, have you mapped it yet? And he said no, so it became a very nice partnership. So what is a social network? Some people may think the term social network is synonymous with LinkedIn, or the term social network may be synonymous with social capital. But a lot of sociologists and people who work on social networks think of them a little bit more precisely, or a little more clinically, as a network where people or organizations are the nodes, and then there are links between them. So there's a certain number of nodes, there's a certain number of edges. Here's two very basic examples of social networks. The one on the left here is one of the first known kind of what we call a sociogram, or something drawn out here by Joseph Moreno in 1934. And this was looking at class structure of first graders. So we have boys and girls in different shapes here, and then we have a directed network of who said that they were friends with each other. The network to the right is more recent, and this was the network from the Ad Health Project in North Carolina of high school friendships. And the color here represents the race of the students. And the students were able to say who they were friends with. And this is from Moody, Race, School Integration, and Friendship and Segregation in America. So you can see here that this is a very powerful way to understand how groupings are forming, and a principle that we call homophily in social network sciences, meaning that like tends to connect with like. There's a lot of questions that a geographer might have about this network. For example, do these students, do they live near each other? Did they go to the same elementary schools? Do they ride the bus together? Do they have family members in common? Are they maybe cousins or something? So knowing that a little bit more, not necessarily the cousins thing, but the bus routes, the elementary schools, the neighborhoods, are an important story to things like this, because it could show that the geographic space is also a part of the segregation that we see in this network. So it's good to have both. It's good to have both. As of 2019, social networks are part of our GIST body of knowledge as well. And I was really happy to see that they were interested in including this. And so it's recognized as a part of what we know in GIS and GIS technology. So why put social networks in geographic space? The goal is to discover how social network ties might be influenced by geography. So nearness is one of the obvious mechanisms for social ties. And the sociologists have a fancy word for that called propinquity, which means that nearness means more interaction or more likelihood of being connected, and then vice versa too. So how is geography influenced by social ties? And I think that those are questions that are very open and really need to be, looked at a little bit more. So I think the question of how social network ties are influenced by geography is actually a little bit easier to answer than how is geography influenced by social ties. But I'm sure maybe you can think of some really interesting examples about both of those. On how social network ties are influenced by geography. Clearly, if it's hard to get to one another, if there's no transportation mechanisms, back before we had, cars and stuff too, that was a bigger deal. Or if there's a language boundary, if you're in 2 different countries, administrative units, mountain ranges, anything that kind of divides us may guide that social network. And then how is geography influenced by social networks? We can think of organizations, we can think of power, we can think of chain migration or little ethnic enclaves, and how the social networks change the geographic space. So the objectives here of putting a social network in geographic space, and I mean like right in the GIS, is to embed social networks into GIS, make new metrics and visualizations to help analyze their properties, and assess analytics in comparison with expectation in other networks. So there's been so much networks in geography, and we know from Dr. O'Kelly's work, right, in your department, that they've been around for a long time, flight networks and all the good transportation work that's done in your department as well. That all takes a lot of network science to understand those principles. These work a little bit differently since they're non-planar and they're more conceptual networks, and they're hard to see and they don't optimize well, and it's hard to see what's moving along the network. So there's a whole bag of paradigms that make these a little bit tricky. Nevertheless, it's good to try. So how do we map a social network? How to? First of all, you have to decide what your nodes are going to be. So maybe migration locations, so places where people have lived, your daily activity space. It's really nice to talk to the audience here who knows what an activity space is. The real-time location, so where people are in real time, their home address, or their administrative locale, like mapping them to a centroid or to a random place within a school district or within a county. I see the last 2 being the most prominent of these. Decide what your edges will describe. And I just want to say from step 1, decide what your nodes will be. Maybe they're going to be an individual, or maybe it's an organization like a food pantry or a religious facility or a university. Decide what your edges will describe. Are they going to be telecommunications data? So for example, how many emails are sent, or how many SMSs, or how many likes? Evidence of a tie from self-report. So these types of surveys or interviews that we give, like saying, oh, who are your emergency contacts, or who are the people that you trust, or tell us where your friends are, or where your family is. And these surveys can be very, very intensive and very long, asking people to list out all their contacts. There are some passive ways to collect this information as well, such as shared bills, like when you both use your credit card for something, or we were looking at today just contact tracing too. That is just exploding in this area, but it's something that I don't work on at the moment. But looking at when you both logged into a Wi-Fi at the same time as well, or social media friendships or links, like you all are friends on Facebook. And then you codify how your edges interact with underlying geography. So after you have the nodes, you've pinned them to a geographic space, you've decided what their edges are going to be, you have to also decide whether you want them to have direction, you have to decide how you're going to weight them, kind of similar to a road network, but not as complicated as the road network. Road network has a lot going on. And then codify how your edges interact with the underlying geography. Does that mean that you need to know also the path, the walking path? So these friends, their relationship depends on them getting to hang out with each other and take walks and walk to each other's houses or bike to each other's houses. So if that built environment changes, that's going to affect their relationship in some way. Or whether they fly across the country and how much the flights cost, etc., now that they can't do that anymore. So you have to codify how these edges are interacting with the underlying geography so that your spatial joins aren't picking up things that aren't that important, for example, or that buffering that line might not mean very much. So that's how we know what kinds of operations and tools to use when that actual edge is in the GIS. Because GIS, is built a lot for environmental types of things, And we've done a lot with topology rules, but for conceptual flows, it is still very hard for us to just say, all right, it's just conceptual. So what are the major tasks we perform with spatial social networks? So here's just a small set of tasks that we perform with spatial social networks. We can look at just dyads, which is just pairs of people. And the work I've done here has been looking at romantic relationships and what they need from the built environment. Have shown that they really like the outdoors. So people make a lot of their special memories. Couples tend to make a lot of their special memories hiking or going to the arboretum or going on walks, etc. So those would be a dyadic relationship. I've also looked at mentorships with big brothers, big sisters, and looking at how certain neighborhoods sort of radiate out and perform mentorships with youth in other neighborhoods and what those patterns look like. This one might be an egocentric network, which you just might have one person and you say, where are all the contacts of that person? These are quite popular, especially because the data is a little bit easier to find than the entire social network. And by the way, there's not always such thing as an entire social network because it keeps going and going and going. But then you don't need to know that's interties between the people and then those people's ties, and it kind of explodes exponentially. So these ego-based networks are kind of popular for knowing where people's contacts are. The next type of analysis you can do are node role analyses. So you might have somebody with what we call a high degree, so a lot of friendships. So that might be these big blue dots in the middle here. They have a lot of social ties. So where all are these people that have all the social ties and all the friends? Do they live in a swanky part of town? Do they live close together, or are they far away? And then what about the people on the periphery? So these yellow people, are they also on the periphery of geographic space, or are they just sort of mixed in? And then we have isolates too in a network, which doesn't necessarily mean that they have no contacts. It just means that they don't have any contacts in this specific network. Are they interspersed in geographic space with the rest of these nodes, or are they in a specific place too? If somebody's on the periphery and it's harder to see them, we have an overarching hypothesis that they'd also be disconnected in the social network. And often that hypothesis gets disproven, but it's a good null hypothesis to start out with. If you're on the periphery of the geography, you may also be on the periphery of the network. But of course, we get into a lot of edge effects, and I know Dr. Monroe is an expert on that, so that would be a good thing to study as well, the edge effects of these networks. Modules. So modularity is a very, very popular thing to do with networks. And what modularity does is it slices the networks into different parts, different components. And mathematically, there's so many ways to do this. And there's never really a perfect way, but we have a factor that usually goes by Q, which is about how well we slice up this network. And Q can be calculated in a bunch of different ways. So our modules, when we get a module, are they tight together? Like kind of this like tight-knit community type of thing? Or is this module spread out all over space? If you have a lot of friends in academia, it's likely that either now or at some point, you all are spread out over a very, very far range and across different countries, etc. But maybe the neighbors of the neighborhood you grew up in, you may have a social network there, and it's actually a very, very small, it takes up a very small geographic space, because even though the academic network may have been place-based at one time, that's a community that tends to move a lot. And then lastly, we have diffusion, which people are sort of scrambling right now, and they've been scrambling for the past almost year to look at how something would, when it diffuses through a network, diffuses in geographic space due to the epidemic, due to the pandemic. And it's a very, very hard problem. We just know that things don't, when they diffuse through a social network, they don't diffuse Euclideanly through geographic space. They zig, they zag, they go back and forth, or they diffuse a little bit Euclideanly and then a lot of zigzagging and hopping. So it's not always an easy problem. So the goal of this was to explain a couple of things that we can do with social networks when we put them in geographic space. So other people are doing this research, and it's just been really wonderful to see, you know, sparks of things burgeoning here and there. And this is one example that has gotten a lot of attention over the past 10 years, and it's just a wonderful example. So organized crime in geographic space has really popped up as spatial social networks to follow. This example here is on neighborhoods in Los Angeles and gang memberships across neighborhoods in Los Angeles with turf. So there's different turf here that is in the purple, and then there's different gangs that are located around the turf, and then the ties between them are rivalries. So this is sort of a reverse social network if you think of social networks as having some sort of beneficial properties. But it's interesting to see where these sort of rivalry cliques pop up, whether there are rivalries that sort of hop over closer nodes, and what this system looks like. So there was not a lot of computation that went involved in this specific paper, but it's still a really, really interesting geographic example. I also want to mention the security efficiency trade-off in organized crime, and that's something I'll go into a little bit more later, but it basically means that if we stay all close together, we can be kind of safe, or if we spread out, we can be kind of safe, and if we stay close together, we can be pretty efficient, or if we spread out, we can be pretty efficient. And so it's a little complicated, but again, I'll go into that as we get a little into the Mafia. And then finally, here's just a couple more examples of the rise of spatial social network studies. This first one here, Catherine Faust, Barbara Entwistle, and colleagues over at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, was one of really the first examples that I saw that I really took to. And they did the Nang Rong district in Thailand. They had a really long project there looking at a bunch of different sociological considerations. And they found some really amazing things, like the role of religious facilities in conducting relationships. This small diagram over here is a social network of tractor sharing that they found in the area. So they collected data on who shares tractors with each other. And the background here are different land uses. And mathematically, they found that tractor sharing within the same land use. I'm not really sure how they dealt with Euclidean distance, but tractor sharing within the same land use was a lot more prevalent than tractor sharing across land uses. You can see there's a little puddle of land use up here that's still green like the rest of these. And so it's interesting to see from that how the underlying geographic space dictated some of these ties. Dr. Root's work, we see her work here as well, the integration of spatial and social networks in disease transmission studies. This is such a great paper because it took, I think what was, I don't want to misspeak, but I believe it was Moran's-I, and it looked at the different calculations within the social networks and then within clustering and geographic space and brought those things together. And then we see some of our other geography colleagues on here, and we really, really want to, push this kind of research forward. And I'm sorry if you know of some really great SSN research that I'm missing from this. I just want to also take this moment to say that we're really focused on these ties as interpersonal relationships. The ties should represent, some sort of interpersonal relationship between people. So part 2 here. To racketeer among friends. I didn't really know too much about the word racketeering until our sociology colleague, Dr. Dan Delaposta, who does Mafia studies, talked to me all about racketeering. And I also don't tend to put, I know that there's a stylistic issue in different fields about having like a kind of ooh, and then a colon, and then sort of the description afterwards. I hadn't done that a whole lot, but it seems to be getting a little bit more popular. And Dan threw that in there, and I ended up liking it quite a bit. So to racketeer among friends, spatial features of criminal collaboration in the American Mafia. So here are our research questions. Do families tend to live in clusters or distributed locations? And by what we mean here by family, it just is not the same as what the sociologists call kin. So kin would be like you're related to each other through blood or marriage. The Mafia families are sort of like the organization, like the Gambino family or the Bonanno family. You have a bunch of different families that you belong to. I'm sorry, you have like one family that you belong to. If you belong to a bunch of different families, sometimes that means that you're going to get into some trouble. All right, the next question is, where do criminal associates live near one another? So where are the criminal associates kind of clustered, and where are nearby members likelier to be associates? So if you have someone else, you know, you have a neighbor down the street who's also in this network, are you all associates or not? So that's sort of like a prior there. And then are high degree members found near their family centers? So if you're like a Mafia boss, or if you have a lot of ties, are you sort of in the thick of things, or are you on the periphery? And then are they in high income areas? I don't have any maps on that right now, but we did the analysis and the answer is no, they are not in high income areas. Or are they near strategic physical features? And for this, we really didn't find a whole lot of statistical evidence, but we have some visualizations. Does the network exhibit efficiency or security in geographic space? So this efficiency security trade-off is something that we're going to examine too. And that's a whole entire structural type of property of saying, how are the people here distributed to stay safe, or are they living near each other so that they can transfer goods, information, etc.? So here's how the data was collected. These are dossiers from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which is now the FBI, for La Cosa Nostra. And so what Dan did was he compiled these paper dossiers. He went in and typed out all the names. Here is Big Frank, and here's some information about Big Frank. Here is Big Frank's address. Some of them were in prison at the time, and so the address is a little bit, we're not really sure 100% of the time. He has kin, that was in one section, but that's not in our network. And then they have the criminal associates here, the criminal associates. So that was how they made the network. That's how they made the network. And then sometimes they have some places where they hang out, some of their hangouts. You probably can see this a little bit better than I can. Yeah, oh, here we go. Locales frequently, the Cuckoo Club, the Hula Hut, the Java Club, all in San Diego. Those things were hard for us to digitize now because they may no longer be there. So we geolocated the addresses using APIs. We had very little trouble with that. We used 680 members. It's non-directional. The ties are unweighted. The network includes one woman. The age range was 18 to 80. About half were born in Italy. The US born are most often Italian. And most had fronts like importing olive oil, cheese, and sometimes they run ice cream parlors. And so they had a lot of like jobs that they did, like storefront jobs, and then in the back room they were doing other things. And this was a very violent group. This was a very violent group that that brought about a lot of fear and violence to their neighborhoods. All right, here's what the Mafia network looks like. So 680 members, 2699 edges. The average degree was about 7, but it ranged up to 77. So that means the number of ties. The diameter, so how long the network was, how many hops, was 10. The average path length in the network was 3.88. So take 2 random people and how many hops to get to them. And then the clustering coefficient, saying like, what's the probability that my friends are also friends, is about 0.31. So in this example, which was made in the software Gefi, the nodes are measured by, the nodes are bigger if they have more contacts, and the color is the different family. The node is bigger if they have more contacts, color is a different family. And over here, this agglomeration here is New York's 5 major families. And then you can see that the families, since a lot of the nodes are colored or similarly clustered, you can see that the family drives a lot of the connections in this network. Here's just critical statistics by family of this network. The Genovese family, the Lucchese family, Gambino families were the biggest ones, and they are located in New York. Detroit, Chicago, LA, and then the Profaci family was also located in New York as well. And then the Bonanno family was also located in New York. But these were the geographic locations of the families. And the family was usually named for its locale, unless it was one of these big 5 New York families, which, as you can see, takes up quite a chunk of our data set. And the New York families can be distributed across multiple different cities. Oftentimes, they sent people to different cities to help get the drug trafficking and just sending them out to do all sorts of different business. This is the spatial distribution here of the network. Same family ties are in orange, cross family ties are here in gray. And the Miami, there's a lot of people down in Miami. It didn't have a predominant family there. It was sort of a turfless place, but a lot of the families sent representatives down there to import goods from Cuba, and there's a lot of gambling going on down there at the time, especially in South Beach. Here's Joseph Bonanno, who is a very popular Mafia member, and he was also known as Joey Bananas, and he had a falling out with his family, and he moved to Tucson. So he's living here alone in Tucson. Here's a little bit deeper of the region around Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, New York City. The most common cross-country ties or cross-city ties were in Miami and New York. So Miami, New York had a lot of ties going back and forth. San Diego and nearby LA had a lot of ties. And then New York and Detroit also had a lot of ties between them. And the reason why this was, in part because 2 of Joe Profaci's daughters married sons of Detroit mafiosi, William Tocco and Joe Zarelli. And so they had like a marriage partnership between Detroit and New York that was also very interesting. And here they are. They're wearing heavy winter coats. Detroit is very cold, as we know. Here are drug connections. This was from the US Senate from 1963. So this isn't exactly, this includes people not necessarily in our network, not necessarily in the Italian mafia that we're studying, but it looks at the network of drug trade across the US. And so having a distributed network, not all being in the same place, not all being in the same city, really helped moved especially drugs across the country. So do connections often stay close by? Yes. This edge distance distribution here is like the enemy of a map. You're like, why don't you just map them? That's a good point. But we can see here that most of the ties were very close by. So let's get into our research questions again, and I'll tell us a little bit more about why we care about each one of these. I do want to say that this is very methods driven. So the methods here are pretty new that we're talking about. So the first question, and I'm going to go through these pretty fast since I've been gabbing a bit. Do families cluster or disperse spatially? Do families cluster or disperse spatially? So the answer to this is we made a cluster plot. So we took the standard distance of the families, so to see how spread out these were. And this is a typical point pattern metric to say what is the standard distance like between this point within this point pattern to capture this point pattern. So the Genovese family was spread out the most. They're also the largest here. We have them the circles big and small by tie. But they ranged quite a bit in the density of the network. So how dense was this network? Have nothing to do with geographic space, just how many edges drew them all together. And the number of edges that you can have total would be n times n-1 divided by 2 because it's not directed. That would be the number if all the nodes of all the ends were connected. So we had a family here, the Profaci family, which was very sparsely connected, but they were very clustered in geographic space. And then we have things that are the reverse, like the New England family that was all over geographic space, but it was very highly clustered, like the people were really tight knit, but they were geographically spread out. So looking at this from this perspective, we can see the distribution and whether there's a correlation or a trend between these this correlation. And we found a little bit of a correlation here. And the actual numbers are in my PowerPoint notes, but the way this is set up, they're a little bit hidden right now. So I'll actually ask you guys to read the paper if you're interested later. Here's an example of the St. Louis family. So you can see this one has a network density of about 0.5, but they are extremely clustered. So they all were in St. Louis. This family was all in St. Louis, and their cluster was about 0.5. So just because they all lived in the same place doesn't necessarily mean they were all known associates with each other. And this means that there may be a point person there that's sort of dealing with different people, but they don't form a clique. All right, question number 2. Where do criminal associates tend to live near one another, and where are nearby members likelier to be associates? So this one is one I'm very, very excited about, and it actually leads into another paper because I got really into the GIS methods here. But basically what we did was we chose a moving window neighborhood, and we calculated the number of edges. So not necessarily the number of nodes, but the number of edges that are there. And then we calculated the network density too. So given the nodes there, was it dense or not? So we looked at this mostly for New York City because looking at it from the prior country would have changed our window scale, and it would have resulted in some very, very difficult neighborhood definitions spatially. So we just came into New York City here. Here we see that if you have a redder number, it means that a high percentage of your neighbors are ties. A high percentage of your neighbors are ties. And if it's gray, it means that none of your neighbors are ties. So you're living next to people who are also in the Mafia, but you don't know them. You're not tied to them. And the data might not be perfect. You may know them, but you might not have been listed as a known associate. And we understand that. But still, they're still not in this network. So for example, there's a lot of gray people over here who are right nearby each other, but they're not known associates. And then we have some clusters of people who are near each other and who are connected with each other. So what does this actually mean? It means that there's a potential for more crime on the streets, maybe potential for meeting in person more easily. We don't really know how this played into their actual stories, but we do know that there are certain places where there were a lot of connections, and there's certain places where there are a lot of local members. And so we did this for a lot of different neighborhood distinctions. We did the node scan and the edge scan, and we got to fish out of this where these connected areas were. We did a sensitivity analysis on it, and I'll point you to this paper in a second, because as you know, just choosing one window size, or we took 10 nearest neighbors, or we took Euclidean or Manhattan distance of 1 kilometer. That's very arbitrary, so we want to do a lot of different windows. But this is what I was kind of excited about here, was that when we had the node scan, so the network density scan, so what is a statistically significant group of high network density points? They turned out a little bit different than the more typical GI hotspot detection of just the points. So if you wanted to find a hotspots of just the points, you would look at these squares here where the squares were filled in with red or more red, but those are different than the hotspots that we found when we considered only the connections between them. So if we're looking for connected hotspots, they turn out a little bit different than if we're looking for your more traditional point clustering over geographic space. And you can read a little bit more about that in this archive paper, which just looks at some more of these GIS methods for this type of, some more scan methods for these networks. So question 3, are high degree members in central geographic locations? So we found here that there's a distance to the median family center. So how far away from you from that center of gravity are you? So there's 4 Genovese family members that are in California. So they sent them all the way up to California. And these are actually low degree members. So people with not a lot of ties in the network. So we didn't know if people were going to send out their more powerful people and their highly connected people to go across the country. But it turned out that they sent more like footmen or henchmen or something like that. They have special words in the Mafia language like capo. So they sent out people with a little bit lower degrees in this regard to California. Here's Joe Bonanno, who we talked about a second ago. These are all Miami-based agents who were from New York originally. So they range in degree here. So they sent some low degree people to Miami, and then they sent some higher degree people to Miami. So this is the answer to this question a bit, is power in strategic locations. We also look to see whether high degree members were in central geographic locations. So remember the leader of the Bonanno family, the Gambino family, the Genovese family, the Lucchese family, and the Profaci family, they tended to live pretty close to the median centers of their family, but not right on top of them, except for Giuseppe Profaci. And the whole Profaci family really lived in this part of South Brooklyn here in Dyker Heights. They were very, very concentrated, but perhaps you remember they're very concentrated, but they really weren't, they didn't know each other in the network. So they're disconnected, but very, very spatially concentrated. And then we found that there were some of the higher degree members tended to live nearer to the water. We found that just visually, we didn't find it statistical evidence for it, but when we were just panning around and sort of looking, we found that a number of these high degree members wanted to live near the water, and we were wondering if possible. There was a lot of shipments from Italy and ports bringing in olives and cheese and other types of things, and if that might have helped or not with that. Here's some interaction for the turf. When we have more families in a small radius, we overlaid them with each other and found that there were certain areas where there were up to 4 of the 5 families represented. So their turf wasn't, and their homes weren't necessarily all sectioned off. Like, this is your part of New York, this is your part of New York. They were very interspersed with each other. And then finally, I'll answer whether the network leans towards efficiency or security. You may have heard of small world networks that have a high clustering coefficient and a low path length. And if neither of those mean anything to you right now, I apologize. They're maybe a little bit too out of left field. But we did find that this was a small world network just by looking at the network structure, not in geographic space. To look and see if it was efficient or secure in geographic space, we did something a little bit different. We looked at the route factor, which is a very old method here. And it's how many hops do you have to take to get to somebody, and then how far away do they live? So we would think that your first degree ties would be nearby, your second degree ties would be farther, and then your maybe 5th degree ties would be even farther away, would be our null hypothesis. And this is run from a simulation, because we don't have these answers for social networks yet. Hopefully one day we'll have a ton to compare to, but we don't have them right now. But our null hypothesis is that this would go up, that there would be a positive trajectory here. So as you have a higher Euclidean distance or travel time between people, we would think that they are friends of friends of friends. And as they live nearby, we would think that they might be first degree ties or connections. Again, null hypothesis. So this is what our networks looks like. So we have distinct categories here that roughly translate to walking distance, a little bit of driving distance outside the MSA, about halfway across the country, and then all the way across the country. And we generally do see an upward trend here. We generally do see an upward trend, meaning that as you go farther in distance, you are less likely to be first degree ties. And if you're very close, you're less likely to be the 6th, 5th, and 7th degree ties. And we find that the same family is a little bit bottom heavy here. So if you are in the same family, you're likely to be close together. But for the cross-family ties, it really kind of does go up a bit. And then the last thing I'll point out here, because I'm about to close up, is a new method called the flattening ratio. So the flattening rate, we think it's a new method. The flattening ratio means that we reconfigure the network to say, okay, if we wanted to keep the degree distribution and make this the most efficient network possible, so keep the degrees similar, but make it so we find the closest new node first, and we reconfigure the network and optimized it, and that would be right up top here, this most efficient network, and then we compare it to the actual network. So this would be the sum of all the distances in the most efficient network we could get. Let's say we want to use as little strings as possible. And then the actual network, what would that ratio be? So the flattening ratio here for our network is 0.17 for the total. For the non-family ties, this network is not very efficient at all. It's less than 0.1, but for the family ties, it's pretty efficient. It's a pretty more efficient at 0.279. This was from prior work with another network in Uganda, in Kibale National Park here. And so these were some other numbers, but we don't have enough numbers right now to really contextualize this in a bigger framework of saying, oh, here's how that worked for this Meals on Wheels network. Here's how this worked for this mosque network. We really need more of those to contextualize how efficient these are. All right, and let me just wrap up here. I know I'm running out of time, so this is my last slide. What's next? A larger vision for spatial social networks. So collecting spatial social networks and starting a repository of case studies, I think that would be super great. Describing regularities. So what is a business as usual network like? And I think I just mentioned that too. And then what would anomalies look like? We can do simulations, we can repermute the network, we can do a lot of things to it mathematically, but we really do want to see just more and more networks and what their properties are. So we can create kind of better null hypotheses about what a network would look like. We want to formalize some more of these metrics and code them up so people can use them, more teaching of spatial social networks in the classroom, and then putting SN data in action for spatial problems as well. And then this thing over here is sort of a dream I have called BuzzNet. Buzz is our, he's a yellow jacket. He's a wasp. They don't like to call him a wasp, but he's a wasp. Here at Georgia Tech, that is our mascot. And so this is sort of a dream I have about a gateway for spatial social networks here with research tools and education and a lot of different case studies. And so I'm hoping that one day we can come together and do a bit more of this research together. All right, and I'm going to stop there and take some questions. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you very much, Clio. That's really interesting talk. And let's welcome question from students first, and then we'll move on to faculty. So if you have any question, please put in the Q&A session. Meanwhile, maybe when we are waiting for questions to come in, Clio, could you talk a little bit about your related work on political polarization? And
sure.
Maybe related work related to social flow and information flows in cities.
Well, those are two kind of different things. But I'd be happy to take show you the political polarization work. Absolutely. Let me just pull that up. So this paper actually got a lot of support, and I think it's because one of the and I'm going to share again here. One of the figures sort of went viral, so that always helps. But in the reviews, it was called the reviewer wasn't happy with it. He or she called it a ridiculogram, which was unfortunate. But what this was I'll just pull up this picture that was pretty popular here, was through the years 1949 all the way to the present. Each dot represents a congressperson. If they're blue, they're Democrat. if they're red, they're Republican. And the ties between them were when they agreed on a bill together. So when they voted the same way on a piece of legislation in the House. So this isn't the Senate, we looked at the House. And we saw over time that there was a lot of cooperation beforehand, but starting around like the beginning of the Clinton administration, 1991, 1993, and when Newt Gingrich was the speaker, there was a lot less collaboration. And when we did see some of the collaboration, they actually turned Republican later. So they were sort of just waiting for that. And we ended this in 2013, but we've looked at the numbers since, and unsurprisingly, it has not gotten any better. So, so that's that political polarization research. Yeah.
Thank you. That's interesting.
We
had a question from Nicole Foss.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I'm gonna read it out loud then. It looked like that you had a slide on the future historical context. Could you talk a little bit about that? Thank you for the excellent presentation.
Okay, sure. Do you mind repeating that?
Sure. So could you talk a little bit about the slide on the future historical context?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was just running out of time, so I switched that. So I skipped that. Nothing like a speaker that goes too far over time. All right, yeah, future historical context. So we stopped here with this research. It's mostly being used as kind of a GIS thing. But if there was somebody out there, somebody who's really interested in digging deep into more of the ethnographic, sort of really rich storytelling aspects of this, like what New York was like in the 60s, where these clubs were, where their turf was, what are sort of the stories that came out of this, and pinning that to the geographic space. We'd really like to work with you. We'd be happy to share all of the data and do anything we can to make this sort of a geographically rich kind of thing to look at.
Thank you. Any question from the student? Or should I move on to faculty question?
Okay, I don't mind reading them if that's okay.
So another question, thanks for your presentation. It is an interesting topic. Did you look into the spatial variation of the network? That is, the connection between families may be different in different cities.
The connection between families may be different in different cities. Spatial I thought we did. The connection between families may be different in different cities. I would ask just a little bit more clarification on that. Perhaps it means the connection between families, like what their edges meant, or whether two families had a lot between two different cities. So I'm not 100% sure, and I apologize on that.
Thanks. If the person who asked this question have no follow-up, we can move on to the next question. Harvey has a question. I have a lot of political divide. Political divide you describe as an urban-rural divide. How do we design friendly regions?
Is that in the political partisanship research? Yeah,
so.
that's a great question. How do we design friendly regions? The region is such an important distinction here. I mean, one thing is for the people on the periphery or in the hinterlands, et cetera, to really appreciate the people in the city, and vice versa, the people in the city to really appreciate the people in the hinterlands. I'm hoping regions are friendly already. I know that creating a regional identity is very important, and I think that some things help with that, such as things that may seem to some people as trivial, but sports teams are non-trivial type of thing for that, and creating an identity would be good. Also understanding how everybody contributes to the economy of the region, how the more agrarian or the more rural types of communities do really contribute to the economy of the region and the city and the more information technologies, et cetera, the factories, how all of that works. I think a mutual appreciation of the different industries and the different jobs and the different people is really important for that.
Thank you. So
Yeah.
a question from me, can you talk a little bit about recent development in spatial social network, say in the past 10 or 15 years, and what about the future directions in this subfield?
So some of the past social spatial network kind of things in the past 10 years have been in criminology. So a lot of criminology type of things. There's been some work on like mobile phone calls and stuff, but it tends to be done not at the interpersonal relationship level. It tends to be done more at the aggregate level. So the criminology and epidemiology, I would say, are the most important. Things like needle sharing, transmission of HIV, those types of things have really done magical things for social networks, as well as the criminology type of literature where they're looking at gang connections, they're looking at the use of parks for criminal types of things. And so I would say that those two would be the leaders there. The epidemiology people and then the criminology people have both done really good things with the spatial social networks.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the great talk and great Q&A. So with that, we probably enjoy the rest of our afternoon, and we'll follow up later.
All right. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone, and thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.